conversation with John Lee, who is also a senior fellow here at the Hudson Institute. He is a senior fellow at the United States Studies Center and adjunct professor at the University of Sydney. From 2016 to 2018, he was the senior national security advisor to the Australian foreign minister. He is a leading expert in Australia and in the United States on China, author of many things, and most recently and relevantly for our discussion, this new Hudson report, Deterring China, Imposing Non-Military Costs to Preserve Peace in the Taiwan Strait, which he co-authored with Dr. Lavina Lee, with whom he maintains a close professional partnership. Helping us discuss this report and understand the issues that underlie it today are two further fellows here at the Hudson Institute. First, Thomas Duesterberg, who is an expert on trade, manufacturing, economics, and foreign policy. He has served in leadership roles at the Aspen Institute and at the Manufacturers Alliance. He was Assistant Secretary of Commerce for International Economic Policy. And we are grateful for his commentary today. And he will in turn be joined by Brian Clark, Senior Fellow and Director for the Center for Defense Concepts and Technology here at the Hudson Institute. Prior to joining Hudson, he was at the Center for Strategic and Budgetary Assessments. He's been a special assistant to the Chief of Naval Operations and Director of the Commander's Action Group. In that office, he is a United States Navy veteran and a veteran of its submarine component. So we have a lot to discuss today. This report, which I really commend to the audience, for being relatively modest in length. It packs a great deal of genuine reflection and useful analysis into its short space. It is a reflection on the nature of deterrence and an application of those reflections into the real world situation that we find ourselves in the Pacific. It attempts to get granular on the question of who is it that we, the United States or Australia or whichever power we're discussing here, who is it that we are actually deterring? What does that mean? What do the deterred entities or the entities we wish to deter, how do they see the world? If deterrence is somehow something that exists in the other guy's mind, well, how does the other guy's mind actually tick here, and how might we think about applying deterrence? It attempts to, and I think succeeds, in introducing some nuance into what can be kind of a rigid debate between hard power, deterrence by denial on the one hand, and soft power, deterrence by punishment on the other, and attempts to get a little bit more nuance into that conversation. And it, of course, concludes, as does any good Hudson Institute product, with practical recommendations for what we're actually supposed to do. So with all of that as preamble, John, I'm going to turn it over to you to lay out your argument for us, and then we'll have Tom respond and Brian respond. I'll lead a conversation and then open it up before the conclusion of the hour to the audience for your questions. So I'm looking forward to a great discussion.
Thank you, Aaron, and I want to thank my two other colleagues, Brian and Tom, for helping me discuss this and discuss the report as well. And thank you all for coming on this very hot day. I'm sure there's been some sacrifice to get here. I also want to thank the Australian Department of Defence, who encouraged and supported this research into this particular report. Now, I think many of you will remember when your former House Speaker, Nancy Pelosi, went to Taiwan rather controversially in August 2022. And what struck me about that whole episode was, whether you think she should have gone or not, Pelosi received more criticism for going and provoking the Chinese than the Chinese did for subsequently doing 4 days of live fire exercises around the entirety of Taiwan. And so this sort of led me to actually propose this report to the Australian Department of Defence, because I thought there were some issues that needed fleshing out. Let me just spend 10 minutes at most going through some of the main points of the report. Then after a couple of comments by my colleagues, I would love to be in conversation with you guys. The two main reasons why I wrote this report, the first is that, when Chinese President Xi Jinping tells us, or tells the PLA to be ready for war within this decade, we should take him seriously. We should believe him. Xi's the first Chinese leader to promised the delivery of Taiwan in his lifetime. He's 71 years old. And given that no one in Taiwan these days would trust a one country, two systems model, which is what Hong Kong is suffering through right now, Xi, I think, recognizes that for him to get Taiwan, he would prefer not to use force, but force is probably necessary. So that's the first point. And the second reason I wrote this report, which leads from what I just said, is that if indeed that is how Xi thinks and we should take him seriously, then deterrence has to be the priority. Now, the approach we're generally committed to, the United States, allies and others, is one of deterrence by denial. And what that really means is that as long as you can persuade China that it cannot launch a successful military invasion of Taiwan, then China will be deterred and everything's okay. Now, the other part of deterrence in traditional thinking is deterrence by cost imposition, particularly in what is referred to as a grey zone. That is, that every incremental move China makes to put itself in a better position to ultimately launch a successful invasion of Taiwan, China needs to suffer a cost. And that's what cost imposition deterrence means. So, some of you who may study the literature of deterrence, one of the great foundational thinkers is Thomas Schelling. He argues, very rightly, but also very practically, that deterrence is ultimately a negotiation with the adversary, and imposing pain, as he puts it, gives you more leverage in that negotiation. Now, the cost imposition element of deterrence when it comes to Taiwan in current American policy and allied policy is neglected, and I argue that this is very dangerous. So let me say why I think this is a real problem. A static notion of deterrence, which is what we're currently committed to, it relies on issuing of red lines to China with the warning that if China crosses this red line, it will not be able to achieve its objectives. So long as China doesn't cross the red line, which is a military invasion of Taiwan, then it won't suffer any great costs and we can live with whatever China is doing at the moment. Now, the problem with this current approach that the United States and others have taken is that it doesn't actually align with how violence and wars begin or tend to begin. So if you think about Putin's annexation of Crimea in 2014 and the seeming indifference of the West to that act and the consequences of that act, and you think about Russia's subsequent full-scale invasion of Ukraine, there's a direct connection in terms of the conditioning of Putin to continue along that sort of escalation to what we have today. Or in a very different context, you consider the October the 7th attacks against Israel by Hamas. Now, these attacks, they were preceded by just constant incursions, constant rocket attacks, which were largely left unanswered because Israel could destroy most of these rockets. But what it meant was there was a psychological and strategic error being made by Israel because it gradually encouraged Hamas to plan and eventually execute what we saw on October the 7th. So now you look at what China's doing with Taiwan, what people call the salami slicing tactics against Taiwan, which is the constant maritime and air incursions, partial blockades of Taiwan, the cyber attacks and all these sorts of things. Now, with each instance of aggressive intent or action not responded to, China creeps ever closer to this red line. This is because with each unpunished advance, China forms the view that Taiwan and its allies lack the preparedness and a resolve to act if that red line is one day crossed. Now, in addition to that, with each incursion, a lot of people sort of say, oh, this is China's showboating, this is China just coercing Taiwan. But it's more than that. With each incursion that China makes, it improves its tactical and operational competence in launching a future successful invasion of Taiwan. So if we're saying to China, hey, we're not prepared to absorb the smaller costs of your salami slicing tactics, why would China believe us if we say, oh, but if you cross the red line, we'll absorb massive costs just to stop you from achieving what you want to do if you ever do use force against Taiwan. So therefore, just as China tries to condition us to accept, internalise and to normalise its aggression, we need to condition China to internalise and normalise a reality where it will bear increasing costs if it continues to coerce Taiwan in this incremental and constant way. Now, the great challenge is to change the mindset from merely retreating behind a proposed red line, which this is where we're currently at, to active cost imposition against China for the purpose of deterrence. So currently, as I mentioned, Chinese coercion and aggressiveness has been internalised, it's been normalised, which is why Nancy Pelosi, rather than Beijing, was criticised for provoking China. So the narrative and the mindset needs to change. Constant American-led cost imposition against China for acts of aggression against Taiwan, that needs to be normalised, that needs to be internalised by all nations, and that needs to become a part of strategic rally in the region, where even if nations don't like America doing cost imposition deterrence, nations just need to accept that it's going to happen. If they accept it's going to happen, then they're more likely just to work around it and to even put pressure on the Chinese to moderate some of its behaviour against Taiwan. Now, of course, there needs to be a change in mindset in the US and with its key allies. We need to accept the cost and risk of this kind of deterrence to ultimately avoid the far larger cost and risk of stopping or preventing a successful Chinese invasion. So let me now just quickly move on to what cost imposition deterrence of China looks like in this so-called grey zone. Now, given that Xi Jinping's personal authority over all significant decisions taken by the party, given that role that he has, to simplify, deterring China basically means deterring Xi Jinping. So the question is, how do you inflict pain on China that matters to Xi? Because you don't want to inflict pain on China when Xi doesn't actually care about it, even though other parts of the country are bearing that cost. Now, what might seem rationally prohibitive to the PLA or even the Chinese Communist Party might not actually be prohibitive to Xi. So if you actually look at personal ideology of leaders in these positions of powers, for example, if we actually studied Putin and his personal perspectives and risk tolerance more carefully, I think there would have been greater and more effective efforts to deter Putin from what he's done in Ukraine. Now, I've just looked at, I won't go through it for the purpose of time, but I sort of looked at some instances where Xi has been forced, or Xi has blinked, where United States or others have actually done things where Xi has blinked. So, for example, the sanctioning of Huawei really bothered him by the Trump administration. The sudden abandonment of zero COVID by Xi, that occurred because he decided that the personal cost to his leadership and to his standing was no longer worth the policies that he had apparently been committed to for a long time. So the point I'm making is that we need to construct a hierarchy of Xi's priorities and vulnerabilities as he perceives them, not as we perceive them, but as Xi perceives them, for the purpose of populating, what you might call an escalatory ladder of cost imposition, but non-military cost imposition, because we don't want to spark an inadvertent kinetic incident in the Taiwan Straits. Now, this would certainly include actions against Chinese tech companies essential to Xi's flagship plans, such as Made in China 2025 and his dual circulation policy. The report, if you go through it, it actually classifies sort of 5 levels of priority that Xi Jinping himself has come up with to maintain his personal standing and security state. But the key is to impose a cost on these Chinese entities each and every time China does something in the grey zone against Taiwan that we find acceptable. There needs to be an immediate tit-for-tat response to essentially convince Xi that every unacceptable action that he takes in the grey zone will bear a cost for him. Now, this will be disruptive. Of course, corporations and businesses will be affected, but they need to accept that the smaller disruption here is for the purposes of preventing a far more disastrous disruption. And here I'm not advocating, a trade war. As I mentioned, a suggestion is a company by company targeting, such that you're not targeting whole sectors, you're targeting the companies that Xi really cares about for his own political purposes. Now, fortunately, we're not starting from scratch here. Businesses are already factoring in a geopolitical risk when dealing with Chinese entities. There have obviously already been American and other international sanctions against Chinese firms. The point is that US firms need to see this as a normal part of the global operating environment rather than as exceptional events that are discretionarily taken by the American government. Importantly, American provisions for secondary sanctions against firms violating this cost imposition regime needs to be enforced and needs to be seen to be enforced. So I'll just leave it there just for the moment to give my colleagues a chance to offer their comments, and then really look forward to a discussion.
Thank you, John. Tom, we'll turn it over to you, sir, for your thoughts on the report.
Okay, thanks very much. It's always a pleasure to be on the same program with John and Brian, and gave me a chance to read John's report with some seriousness, which it always deserves. I always learn a lot from John's analyses of China. A couple of main takeaways that impressed me were his analysis of static versus dynamic deterrence. And I fully agree with his emphasis on the need for dynamic deterrence, and his analysis of the results so far of our efforts to dissuade China from moving down the path it's moving have not been very successful. And it's partly because we haven't responded aggressively to the aggressive actions that Xi has taken as he probes what our response is going to be. The other main thing that I think I learned was through John's analysis of the accumulation of power by Xi Jinping and his reactions to other problems. I think it's very important to understand how China will react to some of the things that we might undertake in terms of actions to deter China. Now, when thinking about deterrence, John's report focuses mostly on deterrence against an attack on Taiwan, which is, of course, extremely important and existential in many ways. And it's important for not only the United States, but especially Japan, South Korea, and others. But also, I think we are going to need, as we develop a comprehensive deterrence plan, we're going to need to think fairly broadly, try to bring in as many allies as we can. We're also going to need to get political buy-in in the United States. So both internally and externally, I think we need to have a broader concept of deterrence other than just deterring a military attack. After all, what Xi is doing is a direct challenge to the world order, if you will, to the economy of the United States, to the economies of the West. So I think we can achieve more political buy-in in the United States and among allies if we concentrate a lot on the economic side as well as the kinetic side. Now, John suggests a number of very specific things that we might do in order to develop this policy of deterrence. And they're tougher policies than we've done in the past. In many ways, China's gotten a free ride on a lot of the things that it's done. And John emphasized how Xi interprets being given a free ride, and the example of Crimea and the Donbass earlier stands out as one example. But let me go through just a few of the things that John mentioned. He notes three major vulnerabilities in the Chinese economy. Food is one, energy another, financial access to Western finance is another. I think we ought to consider, as I think John also agrees, very specific actions to probe what Xi's response is going to be, and tougher actions than we've taken in the past. On food, China's gotten a free ride on all their environmental actions, which are degrading the global environment, not just the Chinese environment. Not only the emission of CO2, but also China's trying to capture the water resources from the Himalaya mountains, which is affecting in a very big way 2 billion people south of China. We ought to try to develop with our allies pushback against that and not give Xi a free ride on that. On the energy side, John mentions the Straits of Malacca as a vulnerability. Well, that would be a tough call if we were to take strong action right now against that. But another thing that China is trying to develop is access to Russian energy and other energy and minerals through the Arctic Ocean. And we've allowed, in certain ways, China to become a participant in the governance of, or at least the thinking about the governance of the Arctic Sea Passage. If it ever becomes fully open, we ought to make it clear that we're not going to allow China to be a free rider on the West and have an alternative to the Straits of Malacca. In terms of finance, there are, surprisingly enough, this administration has finally admitted that Chinese banks are complicit in all kinds of illicit activities, everything from fentanyl, money laundering, selling semiconductors to the Russian war machine, and all kinds of Chinese banks that are intermediaries in this. I think we ought to take action against at least some of the regional banks, see how Xi reacts, maybe even some of the four large public policy banks of China. John also goes into some depth about denial of technology to China, and I agree with almost everything he noted there. One other that I think we ought to take a hard look at is the commercial aviation industry, which is intimately tied, of course, in China with the military aviation sector. The commercial sector couldn't exist without Western technology, avionics, jet engines, landing gear, the rubber for the tires. We ought to take a serious look at denying them some of those access to some of those technologies simply because they're going to subsidize their way to try to unseat Boeing and Airbus and other Western aviation makers, and they're intimately tied to the development of their military. So those are just some of my initial thoughts. I look forward to the discussion with my colleagues.
Thank you, Tom. Brian, over to you, sir.
Thank you. And it's great to be here, as Tom said, with my two colleagues. It's great to see John, great to see Tom, and I appreciate the opportunity to comment and to participate. So I'll look at this from the defense perspective, since that's my area of expertise, I guess, or experience. And what I really liked about John and Lavinia's report was how it tackled this question right up front of what is our approach for deterring China? And the U.S. approach thus far, as he said, was deterrence by denial, which has been the kind of hallmark of the Department of Defense's efforts to prepare for a potential China conflict. Is we're going to deploy forces and equip them in a way that convinces China that it will not be successful in an invasion of Taiwan. which made sense as an approach to deter aggression back when the U.S. had more or less the dominant military. And as our own analysis in a study we did last year on dissuasion and John's analysis here shows, we're kind of in a post-dominance era now with the U.S. military, where we have to think about the fact that there are competitors that are on a level playing field, if in some cases not better than the U.S. Not only that, China has some geographic advantages that make it better able to deploy its forces and maintain a kind of a capacity overmatch on the U.S. military. So the U.S. military is no longer in that position of dominance where it could dictate terms to other countries and say, we're going to deny you this, or we're going to stop you from doing that. So now it's a much more of a near-run thing, whether we could really stop an invasion of Taiwan. And, in absolute terms, it's probably not even realistic to say that the U.S. military could deny an invasion because China is so large, could muster so much civilian and commercial capacity. It's so close to Taiwan. When it really came down to it, if China was willing to muster that kind of effort, it could overwhelm whatever the U.S. might do in response. So the question really becomes a matter of risk tolerance. Can we make the invasion of Taiwan happen with such great costs or over such a protracted time period and with such an international impact that it's no longer an attractive proposition for Xi and the Chinese government? So now we're into, as John said, this is Schelling's negotiation concept. And I think the U.S. Department of Defense, the Pentagon, has sort of lost the narrative on that and forgot the fact that deterrence is really a negotiation. They got used to being able to be in such a dominant negotiating position that they never had to worry about, well, what does the other guy think? Because they were always able to dictate the terms because they were the dominant military. Now we're into that negotiation period. We have to think about, well, what is the kind of thing that would cause Xi to think twice about invading Taiwan because they don't necessarily think it'll happen as quickly, or it'll be as clean, or it may be more damaging to the economy than they thinks. So we got to think about what are all the tools we can use to convey the fact that it's going to be more difficult than Xi is willing to undertake. And that's messy. The problem that the DoD has right now is it wants a simple, clean way of analyzing this problem. And the denial approach gives you that, because you can go do the math and figure out, can we deny the invasion? But without having a dominant military, it means every incremental dollar now is poured into the invasion of Taiwan scenario and doesn't go towards other things. And we're starting to see now the impact of that in terms of DoD's force planning, where we don't have enough forces for other events like in the Middle East or in Europe, because we're devoting every incremental dollar into the protection of Taiwan against a potential invasion. And this is great for China, because as we've seen, as John described, this goal line stand of we're going to protect against the invasion, but nothing else, gives China free rein to pursue gray zone and less than warred activities against their neighbors, Taiwan included. But we've left that playing field open. We're allowing them to run around and do what they want to do to coerce and pressure their neighbors. So the way that the U.S. has to get out of this is think about a new approach to understanding what the risk tolerances of China are and what might be the tools we could use to get deterrence by denial restored. The way to get that information, though, is going to have to be by getting into the negotiation with China. And John's concept of using economic tools to be able to counter gray zone aggression is a great way to begin that back and forth, that interaction that's necessary to understand what your opponent's neuralgic points are and your opponent's risk tolerances might be. So there's a way that the Pentagon can turn around and use this economic effort as a way to better understand what the lever points might be for military operations. What would we need to do to make the military operation seem infeasible or unattractive to Xi? But that negotiation has to be undertaken. And I think the big problem the U.S. has right now is they're not participating in the negotiation. It's a one-sided conversation with China leading it mostly. But if you want to understand what your opponent's thinking, you have to get into conversation with them. And this is the way that the U.S. might do it without having to escalate to the level of war. Then one other thing I wanted to bring up here is that the past analyses of deterrence, especially in the U.S. government, U.S. DoD specifically, treat China as a normal nation state where there's governmental organizations that have incentives and equities and things they're trying to pursue, but not thinking of them as a unitary actor, as in Xi is making all the decisions. And that change over the last decade, from China's government acts like other governments to now Xi, it basically drives all decision making within the Chinese government. It has an impact for deterrence because now we have to think about just influencing Xi, which in a way might be good, but in a way it also makes it more challenging to think about what would deter Xi. Now, because you're not in a negotiation with China anymore, you're in a negotiation with Xi directly. So we have to think about what are the things that are going to be pressure points for Xi specifically that might cause him to choose not to invade Taiwan. And to John's point about economic tools, there's a variety of economic paths or tools or levers that might be able to get to Xi. And we have to think about what those might be. I think the idea of looking tit for tat or symmetrical, where we use economic tools that are focused on the specific hostile actions being undertaken. So what are the companies supporting the island building, or the companies that are supporting the maritime militia that's operating inside of somebody else's territorial waters? So going after those specific companies is a way to maybe reach Xi, but coming up with ways that will make Xi think twice about acting further in aggressive ways is going to be really important. I think that gets to the importance of maybe intelligence gathering or the kinds of criminology we haven't done since the Cold War. So you really have to think about this being a unitary actor we're trying to influence rather than a whole government. And with that, I'm going to stop and turn it back over to John. Thank you.
Brian, thank you very much. Thanks as well to you, Tom. I'll kick off with a few questions here. So John, I want to start with, I want to play devil's advocate for a moment and give you a kind of blunt, obvious objection, which you anticipated a little bit in your remarks, but I'd like you to say more. You made reference to the Israelis failing to be more aggressive earlier with Hamas, and that potentially being a cause of what happened on 10/7. I've had similar conversations, and there's a lot of plausibility to that suggestion. But of course, the risk of escalation in that situation is much less threatening to Israel. If things start to escalate, if things had started to escalate between Israel and Hamas prior to 10/7, that's something Israel can absorb, manage, deal with one way or the other. If we were to have the Biden administration represented in this room right now, I suspect that they would say you are underplaying the risks of escalation, that they are very concerned about escalation and limiting it is amongst their top priorities. Why are you relatively unconcerned, as they might slightly unfairly put it? Why are you so sanguine about the prospect?
Escalation is possible. But first, the reason why I wanted to make it non-military was precisely for that. We don't know how the Chinese would respond. Well, actually, that's not completely true. I mean, the United States, in a different context, have levied all sorts of sanctions against Chinese companies and other sorts of economic measures. Sometimes China has retaliated, sometimes it hasn't. A lot of my work is, as is Tom's actually, is based on China's economic vulnerabilities. And I actually think that China doesn't have as strong a hand as a lot of people believe. It still needs a hell lot of finance, of capital, know-how, technology, and so on from American and Western companies. And if China wanted to escalate, it can. But let me just go back to a point that Brian made. We're ultimately trying to know what Xi's vulnerabilities and tolerances are. You're not going to know them unless you escalate and poke him in certain areas. Now, I don't want to do it in such a way that would provoke a war, but this wouldn't. This would be some kind of tit-for-tat economic escalation if China wanted to respond. Sometimes it won't work, but the point is, how many times have you heard, we have no idea how Xi makes decisions and why, and two, we have no idea what he will do. We have no idea about how and why he makes decisions and why, and also what he might do, because we haven't actually pushed him. And unfortunately, the only way you can find out where someone's line is and what his risk tolerance or the way he looks at risk is by probing, in the same way he has done to the United States and other countries in the region. So yes, it's not that I don't take seriously or discount the problems of escalation. I think I make the broader argument that if you don't escalate in this way, tit for tat, China will find itself in a psychological and operational and tactical position where the temptation to actually cross that red line will become more and more probable.
So another historical reference you make in the report is to the 1930s, the failure to be more proactive about Hitler's rearming, remilitarization of the Rhineland, everything that happened sort of in the lead up to 38, 39. And of course, I don't have to tell you, one of the reasons why France, Britain are not more aggressive in that period is because it's not politically feasible.
Yeah.
Their populations, their voters will not support more aggressive action prior to sort of the 38, 39 timeframe. How do you think about generating support in the United States, in Australia, amongst other allies for a more aggressive game plan?
There's a real disconnect between the strategic risk assessments that the United States and its allies are making on the one hand and what they're prepared to do. Because so I know there's not a complete consensus within either American, Australian or allied systems, but their leaders, military leaders, even some political leaders consistently tell us or tell hearings that the prospect of war this decade is getting higher and higher. Right, and that would be the ultimate disastrous scenario. Now, if that is your official assessment, which I believe it is in the United States, which I believe it is in Australia and other places, then to not actually try different forms of deterrence, to me, is irresponsible. Now, there's the related question of, okay, it is a dramatic move because traditionally the United States and others haven't done anything like this. How are other countries going to react? Yes, it will be very unpopular, particularly even in my own country, particularly in Southeast Asia as well, even amongst America's Northeast Asian allies. But remember, you've got to normalise and get countries to internalise things that you need to do. So when China first started advancing in the South China Sea or the East China Sea or in the Taiwan Straits, it was very disruptive. But China got to the point where it did it often enough that countries just normalised it. This is what we need to do. China has to normalise this idea that the United States and others are just hardwired to respond in this escalatory way. Fundamentally, that's what deterrence is about. If we don't do it, I don't think we can deter.
So let me ask a question to both Tom and Brian, and then I'll come back around to you, John. If we were to follow John's plan of, just to use your words, sort of tit for tat probing with non-military measures in response to various Chinese provocations, how do you assess the Chinese or Xi respond to that? Tom, we'll start with you.
Well, as John mentioned, China's economy is not as strong as their own narrative would have us believe. They have lots of incredibly important vulnerabilities. I mean, John has listed them. Dependence on food imports, dependence on total energy dependence. And if we were to give some signs, some concrete signs that we're going to exploit those vulnerabilities, she would have to make the decision about whether or not the old sort of bargain that the Chinese Communist Party has made with its own people, which is sort of growth and prosperity in return for the sustenance of the Chinese Communist Party, and now Xi Jinping himself. I don't think it's straightforward that, even though Xi is somewhat dismissive of public opinion, and it's indicative of his admonition to the young people to when they can't get a job, to eat bitterness like he did when he was sent down to the provinces during the Cultural Revolution. As John's report indicated, he will change when there's enough pressure. He has in the past. He lifted the zero COVID lockdowns in response to the economic suffering and the political blowback from his own people and from elites in China. So I'm not totally convinced that she would not respond to the sorts of incremental escalatory steps that John has proposed.
Brian.
Yeah, Aaron, great question. I think the targeted actions that John has identified, if you are going to do a tit for tat response to, for example, maritime militia interference in fishing operations by the Taiwanese, and we're going to go after the company that runs that set of maritime militia ships, or if we go after the dredging company that is supporting island building somewhere with targeted sanctions, or we cut off their access to the financial system or something. I think China might Xi and China may not respond in a public way to that because they don't want to necessarily expose the fact that they feel like this is a successful operation or that they have a vulnerability there. And there's not much to be gained by maybe being public about the fact that you're being attacked in this very targeted way. So it's an example of, in information operations, one of the things we talk about are signals you can send to your adversary that nobody else sees. And this is something that happens a lot in, for example, electronic or cyber warfare, where you send a signal to your opponent to indicate that I have access to a system and that I'm able to affect it in a way that you may not have realized. Nobody else gets to see that. They don't lose face in the course of that. But the fact that we've done that and we've signaled to them that we can do it is a way of brushing them back potentially. So I think there's a level at which we can conduct these very targeted economic actions in a way that signals to Xi that we've got his number in some ways, but that maybe there's not a lot of benefit to making public the fact that this vulnerability might exist. And then to Tom's point, I think if you take action that's more broad based, so we're going to cut off some avenue of energy or food imports into China. That's going to probably result in a major diplomatic response. So demarches and kind of complaints, and now the U.S. is being seen as an imperialist aggressor. It's just a matter of whether the international community sort of agrees with that. I think one problem we have is if we get too big on the economic actions, we risk having some countries that want to go along to get along kind of go back with China and say that's too much. The U.S. is being an aggressor here. So we got to strike that balance of, is it targeted enough to generate a response on the part of China, without, or is it not too small that then doesn't generate any sort of reaction? The other thing I'll bring up is we have to decide what the purpose of these actions might be, because in some cases the action might be to force them to stop doing something that we don't want them to do. And in some cases, the action is simply to gauge the response and start to build the library of understanding of, what's their risk calculus and what's their belief system. So that's another information operations approach, is I'm just going to probe my adversary to better understand how he ticks. And I don't really care that much about whether he responds or not in a very dramatic way. But I'm just trying to understand, what sort of, incentives he might be operating off of. But those are the kind of the two. I think there's two universes of actions we could take, and then the responses to them might be very different.
Thanks. John, question for you, but Brian and Tom, feel free to weigh in. Help us understand a little bit better the role that deterrence by denial, hard power, deterrence at the goal line plays in your scheme of things. Because obviously it doesn't not play a role. You can't have your plan and then a gap when it comes to a big showdown. How does it all go together?
Look, it plays a huge role in the sense that ultimately, if China thinks it can launch a successful invasion of Taiwan, it's obviously more likely to do it. So obviously, if you don't have that hard power that will deny China the objective, then it's pretty hard to deter China. But I would make a couple of more sort of, I guess, dynamic points regarding that. The first is, as I mentioned, the more China does these grey zone incursions, the better it gets at potentially launching a successful invasion. Because when it does these incursions, it's not just about coercion, it's about practicing a potential invasion, but also positioning itself, holding ground that it's won from that grey zone to perhaps when they launch a successful invasion. It's the first thing. The second is the psychological element. I mean, no matter how much hard power you have, you can't deter an enemy if he doesn't think you're going to use it, right? And my concern is that it is an open discussion in the region will the United States actually come to the defense of Taiwan? Now, the fact that not just China, but that the region is asking this question immediately weakens the prospect of deterrence. So, but they ask this question because the United States and others have shown a very low tolerance for the moment for disruption. So once again, there's a psychological element to it, but there's also an operational tactical element to it. But this is not, and I say this in the report very early, this is not an alternative to deterrence by denial. This is an augmentation of it, in fact, a necessary component as well of deterrence by denial.
You talk a lot about Xi in the report. You've spent years reflecting on what makes Xi tick, and you argue, in my view, pretty compellingly that deterring China is a question of deterring Xi. In a delimited period of time, give yourself a couple of minutes, but not more. What does make Xi tick? Help us understand the worldview. Help us understand the blend of Marxism, Leninism on the one hand, China sort of all the various inputs that people have been arguing about. How do you think about the balance?
Well, look, the traditional view is, before Xi, the traditional view is that the Chinese leader and Chinese leadership, the fundamental thing they want to achieve is regime security, right? So that doesn't change, but there are alterations to it under Xi. Regime security now has almost become, or has almost transitioned into Xi security,
right?
Or Xi as leader security. So I make the point that some things that are prohibitive to the Chinese Communist Party as a leadership group, or even potentially the People's Liberation Army as a military entity, may not necessarily be prohibitive to Xi, right? Because the more power he accumulates, but also the more his personal political survival becomes the motivating factor for decision-making over issues such as this, potentially the greater divergence between what Xi wants and what even the CCP wants happens. So what I've done is, the two main case studies where Xi has blinked that I go through in the report is one, after a couple of years of insisting he's going to defeat COVID, and even a few weeks before he actually abruptly changed his decision to basically allow COVID to spread, he was still insisting this is a core issue, that this is a core policy of mine. That's the first one. The second one was observing him blink when the measures against Huawei were being threatened. Now, why did he blink on those two occasions? Because very specific targeted entities and individuals in China were starting to fundamentally question his policies, his standing, his omnipotence, omniscience, right? So you want to manufacture a situation where if, for example, companies are being targeted in a tit-for-tat way, you want those companies and the interests around those companies to start criticising Xi. So that's sort of how I think about it. The pain has to be borne by Xi, not necessarily by the whole Chinese economy.
Last question from me, and then we will open it to the audience. Talk to us about end states. How would you like to see the situation resolved, as it were? Perhaps that's the premise that needs to be challenged with respect to Taiwan, related but deeply related question. What about the Chinese Communist Party? New Hudson fellow Mike Gallagher recently co-authored a piece with Matt Pottinger in Foreign Affairs calling for a quote-unquote victory strategy, seeking sort of George Kennan-like demise of the CCP in some fashion or another, and that's been very controversial. There's been a lot of debate about that in the last month or so. On either the Taiwan question or the China regime question, where do you come down?
Look, just very quickly on the Taiwan question, whether Taiwan is China or whether PRC is China, I mean, that's really an obsolete, irrelevant question to me these days. What I would want, and I think what the Taiwanese want, is just to preserve their way of life, right, and preserve their way of governance, which means they need some international space and agency and relevancy for that to occur. So I'm not particularly fussed about, whether in fact, I don't think the Taiwanese are particularly fussed about whether they come to be recognised as the one China. I think they realise that's not realistic. It's the end point, if you like, it's just that they have a secure means of preserving your way of life and preserving the way they govern. And if they're not a formal state, I can live with that. I think a lot of Taiwanese can live with that. But they still need to be given the international room to exist as an autonomous entity. On the CCP itself, for me, the CCP, look, even though I speak a lot about the Chinese Communist Party, we have to remember that they have been there since the founding of China, and modern day China of the PRC. And why that's relevant is, if you wipe out the leadership, or if the leadership suddenly disappear miraculously tomorrow, does China change as a nation? And the problem with that sort of type of reasoning is that the Chinese civil society has now been retarded and suppressed for quite a few years, for quite a few decades. So if you just remove the political leadership, you don't necessarily suddenly get a more liberal society. I don't know what you get, but the point is it may not necessarily be the kind of society that you would hope you'd get. So I can't answer the question of what I want to see for the PRC or what the future of CCP should be. I guess I'm just more worried about the external manifestations of what Xi and the CCP want to achieve at the moment, and to prevent that from affecting situation, whether it's Taiwan Strait or beyond.
All right. With that, we'll open it to the room. John's a smart guy and can take anything you throw at him. I would just ask, as always, to please put your passionate view in the form of a question. Yes, sir. And please identify yourself as well when the microphone comes to you.
Stanley Cover. Why can't we deter the Houthis? By your analysis, what are we doing wrong?
I think, Brian, can I defer to you? Because I think you probably understand the on-the-ground situation a lot better than I do on this issue.
Yeah, I think that, to John's, point about, deterrence by denial or deterrence by cost imposition, I think we're doing a lot of denial against the Houthis. A few of their attacks have been successful, but we haven't done much of the cost imposition, right? So there's no cost to the Houthis other than using up material to continuing these attacks. And I think that's where it comes down to is, are we willing to impose costs on the Houthis and then maybe on their supporters back in Iran by doing direct attacks on them at a greater scale than we already have, by interdicting the supply chain that enables the Houthis to continue these efforts, and then are we going after Iran, economically, if not militarily, in ways that hurt Iran as a cost of doing this operation? And we're really not. I mean, so the problem is, we've taken a very kind of defensive first approach to dealing with the Houthis and just hoping that eventually they'll go away or we'll negotiate some settlement. But we have not taken action to impose costs on the Houthis or their network of supporters.
All right. Other questions? Yes, sir, in the back.
Hi, Nate Pekarsik, John, great paper. Really enjoyed reading it. The cases you studied to point to decision-making change included one that was more external, Huawei, one that's more internal in the case of COVID-0. The vulnerabilities you highlighted are largely ones that map onto external measures, so dependence on imported food, energy, US dollar dominance. I wonder if you might have any thoughts on elements of vulnerability that are more domestic or internal that could be incorporated into the type of deterrence strategies you're advancing.
I mean, it's ultimately domestic in the sense that whichever way you're trying to impose costs, domestic entities in China have to start blaming Xi for the pain, right? So that happened during COVID, but even during the Huawei example, for example, domestic entities that would stand to lose were starting to blame Xi, or at least starting to blame Xi's policies directly, and Xi could see that happening. Look, the report doesn't really give, a exhaustive list of actions. That wasn't the intent, because there'll be others who understand the sort of on-the-ground nuts and bolts of China a lot better who could suggest things that would actually create pain for Xi. I think what I hope anyway, the contribution is of the report is to offer some kind of logic and framework to, how do you actually get China to blink? You get China to blink by effectively trying to understand what stresses out Xi, and there are both domestic and external things you can do.
Yes, ma'am.
Hi, I'm Myrna Gallick from the U.S. Institute of Peace. First, I think this report topic is very apt, so congratulations. I think it's a really important question to be asking. I'm curious kind of on your view of this idea of escalating in terms of non-military means like sanctions in a tit-for-tat manner, targeting, let's say, specific companies. How likely is that to be effective if it's only the U.S. doing that? Because our own economic reach is pretty limited in certain areas. And if we can't get, for example, the EU to agree, it might not be a great strategy. And I know the EU has their own approach to sort of the economic engagement with China. Thanks.
Oh, look, I'll give a quick answer, and I don't know if Tom has thoughts as well. I mean, look, obviously you would like other major advanced economies to be part of it, but I'm realistic enough to kind of know that the bulk of any kind of cost imposition is going to come from the US, right? Your question of how effective will be, I mean, one of the main US forms of effectiveness really is financial against a particular company. I know companies can kind of go around it and so on, but once again, like the idea is to produce as many headaches and complications for that company as you can. It may not actually stop necessarily, it may not create as much pain for that company as you would like. But once again, remember what the purpose is. The purpose is to convince Xi that there will be some cost. He may be able to occasionally mitigate some of those costs, but every time he tries to improve his position incrementally, there will be a potential cost being imposed on him. But of course, look, I would love it if there was a unified coherence to it, but I know obviously that's not going to happen.
Time for one or two more. Yes, ma'am, in the back.
Hi, Lillian Ellis with the Global Taiwan Institute. Kind of on a similar note, I wanted to ask if you could elaborate on how to improve the Stand with Taiwan Act and specifically target CCP officials and corporations in China.
I'm wondering if I can cop out and get my American colleagues to talk about this, because it's just that you guys would know more detail about the specifics of the Taiwan Act.
Tom, do you want to weigh in on that?
Well, I'm not particularly an expert on the legislative part of that, but I think what we have to keep in mind is, the threat of China is not just to Taiwan. The threat is to the entire economic structure that drives the United States, but also drives Europe and East Asia. And what we need to do is, I think I'd put more emphasis on trying to get our allies to participate in this dynamic deterrence via the economic mechanisms that we've been talking about. China's economy now is totally dependent on exports of manufactured goods and on access to Western financing for a lot of reasons. Those are two elements where we can exercise just a lot of leverage, and John has mentioned the technology side as well. So I'd concentrate more on those sorts of questions rather than targeting, individuals, because that's where the vulnerability of China really is.
Just a quick comment about Taiwan Relations Act, and once again, I'm not at all, that much of an expert on the act itself, but I would imagine the act is fairly ambiguous, right, about the sorts of actions America would take. I kind of think that's unavoidable because you're never going to have an act like that gives you very specific actions and anticipates every scenario. But that's where the actual psychology and calculation comes into it, and that is, we don't know how administration would respond. based on the Taiwan Relations Act. Neither does Xi Jinping, for that matter. But the whole point is to persuade Xi Jinping that the United States is likely to take a fairly, robust reading of its obligations. And you can only do that if Xi Jinping is convinced the United States is reasonably able to bear risk and costs, which right now I don't think Xi Jinping thinks that. So that's probably how I would answer that question without knowing much about the act itself.
All right, we are at time. John Lee, Tom Duesterberg, Brian Clark, this has been a stacked panel and a rich conversation, and we are grateful to both Dr. Lees for this report on Deterring China. Thank you all very much.